Isabella Grant believed she was minutes away from humiliating a broke single father inside a military hangar full of engineers. She had dared Mason Reed to repair a malfunctioning fighter jet, the very aircraft threatening to collapse her company's billion-dollar contract. Mason said nothing. He simply walked toward the control panel and listened to the engine the way other men listened to a heartbeat. But when military security scanned his identification, the entire hangar went silent within seconds. The man they had mocked only minutes earlier had once been a legend erased from every classified report in the country. Stay until the very end, because the sealed file in this hangar will destroy every arrogant word spoken here today. The Nevada test base sat under a sky so pale it looked bleached, and inside the largest hangar on the property, engineers in matching jackets moved like nervous birds around a single aircraft. Grant Aerotech had spent 3 years and hundreds of millions of dollars developing an upgraded flight control system for the fighter jet program, and the demonstration scheduled for that afternoon was supposed to secure a contract that would define the company for a decade. The hangar smelled of jet fuel and cold metal, and the desert wind outside pressed faintly against the corrugated walls, a sound almost nobody inside the building had time to notice. Isabella Grant walked through the hangar doors with the kind of posture that came from years of being the youngest person in every boardroom she entered. She was 34 years old, sharp-featured, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked out of place among the grease-stained coveralls surrounding her, and she carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in weeks. The board had given her one final demonstration to prove the system was ready, and the military liaison observing from the corner of the hangar had made it clear that further delays would end the partnership entirely. When the diagnostic screen flashed its third error in an hour, Isabella felt the floor of her career tilt beneath her, though she kept her face perfectly still. Because she had learned long ago that panic was a luxury leaders were never permitted to display in public. She had inherited the chief executive title from a father who built the company from a single hangar much like this one, and every decision she made still felt measured against a memory she could never quite satisfy. The board members who had elevated her were the same men who quietly doubted whether a woman in her 30s could hold a defense contractor together under pressure, and Isabella had spent every day since her appointment proving them wrong through sheer relentless competence. That competence, however, had calcified over time into something colder, a habit of treating people as instruments to be deployed rather than individuals worth understanding, and nowhere was that habit more visible than in the way she now surveyed the hangar floor, looking for someone to hold responsible for a failure that was not yet hers to explain. Logan Pierce, the technical director assigned to the program, moved quickly to fill the silence with blame before anyone could question his own department. He gestured toward the maintenance bay where a contracted crew handled lower-level repairs, and his voice carried the practiced confidence of a man who had learned that conviction mattered more than accuracy. He told Isabella that the persistent vibration error almost certainly originated with the maintenance subcontractors, and specifically with a quiet mechanic named Mason Reed who had been brought in only weeks earlier on a temporary contract. Logan painted Mason as underqualified, a man hired because he was cheap and available, not because he understood anything about modern combat aircraft. Several engineers nodded along, because Logan's confidence was contagious in the way that confidence often is, regardless of whether it was earned. Isabella, desperate for an explanation that did not implicate her own technical team, allowed herself to believe him. Mason Reed appeared from beneath the aircraft's open access panel without anyone immediately noticing him, his coveralls stained with engine oil, and his hands moving with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this work for a very long time. He was 39 years old, quiet in a way that some people mistook for slowness, and he carried himself with none of the urgency that filled the rest of the hangar. He did not argue when Logan spoke about him as though he were not standing 10 feet away. He simply turned his head slightly, listening to a low rattling sound coming from somewhere near the aircraft's tail section, a sound none of the engineers with their tablets and diagnostic software seemed to have noticed at all. Isabella glanced at him only briefly, taking in the dirt under his fingernails and the worn boots, and decided within that single glance that he was exactly what Logan claimed he was, a single father who had taken whatever work he could find to support a child he could not otherwise provide for. She did not consider, even for a moment, that the quietest person in the room might be the only one who actually understood what was happening to the aircraft. What none of them knew and what Mason had no intention of telling them was that he had raised his daughter Grace alone since she was barely old enough to walk, working contracts wherever they appeared and never staying anywhere long enough for anyone to ask the kinds of questions that might lead back toward the life he had buried. He had learned to live small on purpose, to let people assume the worst about a quiet man in stained coveralls, because the alternative meant explaining a past that still cost him something every time he revisited it. The hangar around him was full of engineers who trusted screens and software over their own instincts, and Mason found a strange private comfort in that fact, because it meant nobody expected him to know anything beyond the basics of his contract. He had walked into this job the same way he walked into every job, planning to do the work quietly, collect his pay, and disappear before anyone looked too closely at who he used to be. The pressure in the hangar continued building as the afternoon clock ticked closer to the scheduled demonstration time, and Isabella's patience thinned with every passing minute. She turned to her assistant and asked for the maintenance crew roster, scanning it until she found Mason's name listed under a generic subcontractor designation, nothing more than a line item in a budget spreadsheet. Logan saw his opening and pressed further, suggesting that if the error could not be resolved before the demonstration, someone outside the official engineering team should be made to answer for it publicly, both to satisfy the board and to protect his own department's reputation. Isabella, exhausted and furious at a problem she could not solve through sheer force of will, finally gave the order that would change everything. She told her assistant to bring Mason Reed to the center of the hangar floor, in front of the full engineering staff, so that the man Logan blamed could either prove his worth or be removed from the property entirely. It was, in her mind, a simple solution to an urgent problem. She had no idea she was about to challenge a man whose past she could not have imagined in her wildest calculations. Mason stood at the center of the hangar floor with dozens of eyes fixed on him, and he did not flinch under the attention the way Isabella expected him to. She announced, loudly enough for the entire engineering team to hear, that if he believed he understood this aircraft better than the people who had designed it, he was welcome to prove it right there, in front of everyone, before the demonstration clock ran out. Logan added his own commentary almost immediately, telling the gathered engineers that Mason likely knew how to change a filter and tighten a bolt, but understanding the layered software architecture of a modern combat aircraft was an entirely different matter, one well beyond a maintenance contractor's pay grade. A few engineers laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that comes easily when someone already feels safe in their own position, and one of them even pulled out a tablet, ready to record the moment Mason inevitably failed to live up to his own silence. Mason absorbed the mockery without any visible reaction, his expression as still as it had been beneath the aircraft moments earlier. He did not raise his voice or defend himself with words. Instead, he asked a single question that cut through the noise in the hangar, requesting access to the error logs, the wiring schematics, and the vibration data from the aircraft's 3 most recent engine starts. The request confused several of the younger engineers, who had expected Mason to either refuse the challenge or fumble through the primary diagnostic software the way most outsiders did when handed unfamiliar systems. Instead, once the data was pulled up on a nearby screen, Mason asked for something even stranger. He wanted to listen to the recorded engine audio from the most recent test runs rather than rely solely on the numerical readouts everyone else trusted completely. Laughter rippled through the small crowd again, sharper this time, because nobody trained in modern aviation diagnostics led with their ears instead of their software. Isabella felt a flicker of doubt up the both wisdom of her own challenge, but pride kept her from calling it off, and instead she raised the stakes even further. She announced that if Mason failed to identify the source of the error within the time remaining before the demonstration, his contract would be terminated immediately, and he would be permanently barred from every Grant Aerotech facility in the country. Mason did not hesitate before accepting the terms, not because his pride demanded it, but because some quiet certainty in him understood that if this aircraft flew with its current flaw intact, a pilot somewhere down the line might pay for that flaw with his life, and he had carried that particular kind of weight on his shoulders before, in places far harder to walk away from than a hangar in Nevada. He looked at the assembled engineers one last time before turning back toward the aircraft, speaking just loud enough for the nearest few to hear that the error was not hiding in the software at all, but in the one place everyone in the room had grown too confident to actually check. Mason walked a slow, deliberate circle around the aircraft, running his palm along sections of the fuselage and pausing every few feet to press his knuckles gently against the metal skin, listening for the subtle differences in resonance that no diagnostic screen could capture. The engineers watching him exchanged glances, unsure whether they were witnessing genuine expertise or an elaborate stalling tactic designed to buy time before an inevitable failure. He traced the path of the secondary electrical conduits with his eyes, following them from the avionics bay down toward the tail assembly where the navigation sensors were housed, and he stopped twice to examine connection points that looked, to everyone else, perfectly ordinary. After several minutes, he found what he was looking for, a barely measurable discrepancy between the signal sent from the flight control computer and the actual physical response of the aircraft's control surfaces. It was a delay so small that no single instrument flagged it as a failure, yet Mason recognized immediately what it meant under the right conditions. Logan, watching from a few feet away with his arms crossed, accused Mason loudly of inventing a problem simply to stretch out the clock and avoid admitting defeat. Mason ignored the accusation entirely and instead pointed to 3 separate readings on the screen, each one individually so minor that any single engineer would have dismissed it without a second thought. He explained in a voice far calmer than the situation demanded that each of these 3 flaws was harmless when considered alone, but combined under the stress of high-speed maneuvering, they would compound into something the aircraft's safety systems might not catch in time. Carter Hayes, the colonel overseeing military acceptance of the program, had been standing near the back of the hangar throughout the demonstration, and something about the specific language Mason used caught his attention immediately. Mason was not speaking like a maintenance technician describing symptoms. He was speaking like someone who had once flown, or at the very least, like someone who had repaired aircraft in conditions far more dangerous than a controlled hangar in Nevada. Carter had spent over 20 years around pilots and mechanics of every variety, and he had developed an instinct for the particular cadence of someone who had learned engineering through survival rather than through a classroom, a cadence he was now hearing for the first time in years. Isabella remained skeptical, unwilling to abandon her assumptions so quickly, but a thin thread of uncertainty had begun working its way through her composure. That uncertainty deepened considerably when Mason predicted, seconds before the screen updated, exactly which error code would appear next, as though he already understood the aircraft's internal logic better than the people who had written its software. He turned to the nearest engineer and asked them to shut down every automated system on the aircraft for 90 seconds, insisting that some answers could only be found with the machine completely silent. When the automated systems powered down and the hangar fell into an unfamiliar quiet, Mason moved with a speed and precision that startled even the engineers who had dismissed him minutes earlier. His hands worked through the wiring harness behind an access panel with the kind of muscle memory that comes only from repetition under pressure, the kind of repetition that happens in places far more dangerous than a peacetime test facility. He muttered measurements to himself under his breath, numbers and tolerances that meant nothing to the engineers watching, but clearly meant everything to the man reciting them, his fingers tracing connections that had not been touched since the aircraft left the factory floor. A younger engineer, curious about the access credentials Mason had briefly entered into a diagnostic terminal, ran a quick background check out of simple curiosity and discovered something strange. The credentials matched an old special access clearance level that had been deactivated years earlier, a level reserved for personnel involved in classified military aviation programs, the kind of clearance that civilian contractors were never supposed to possess in the first place. Logan seized on the discovery immediately, accusing Mason of stealing restricted access credentials and demanding that security be called before he could do any further damage to the aircraft. Isabella, already unsettled by everything she had witnessed, made the decision to contact military security herself, requesting an identity verification on Mason Reed before allowing him to touch the aircraft any further. Mason did not resist the request or protest his innocence the way a guilty man might have. He simply asked everyone in the hangar to avoid restarting the aircraft's systems until he had replaced a connector cluster that was producing electrical interference, a request that struck Carter as oddly specific for someone supposedly improvising his way through a system he did not understand. Carter, watching the name on the security terminal slowly populate, felt a strange recognition tugging at the edges of his memory, the kind of recognition that comes when a name surfaces from a classified report read years earlier and half forgotten. He remembered vaguely at first and then with growing certainty a mission summary involving the rescue of a downed pilot off a contested coastline, a summary that had crossed his desk during an entirely different assignment. Mason, sensing the shift in the room's attention, deflected every question directed his way, answering only the technical ones and ignoring anything that edged toward his personal history. His reluctance was not the nervousness of a man hiding wrongdoing, but the quiet discomfort of someone who had buried a part of his life so deeply that he no longer wanted it disturbed. The moment of true reckoning arrived when the military identification scanner returned its result, flashing a red warning across the screen indicating that Mason Reed's full service file was restricted, inaccessible at the civilian security clearance level currently active in the hangar. Word of the malfunction and the public confrontation reached the Grant Aerotech board within the hour, and an emergency video call was hastily assembled, the kind of call that ended careers when the wrong answer was given. Board members spoke over one another, demanding to know why the demonstration had been delayed and threatening, without much subtlety, that Isabella's position as chief executive could not survive another failure of this magnitude. One board member in particular, an older man who had voted against her appointment from the very beginning, suggested openly that perhaps the company needed a different kind of leadership entirely, one less prone to what he called sentimental hesitation under pressure. Isabella absorbed the threats with the composed exterior she had spent years perfecting, promising a resolution before the day's end while privately uncertain whether that promise could be kept. Logan, watching the chaos unfold around him, recognized an opportunity to protect himself rather than the company, and he began quietly steering blame further toward Mason, hoping the narrative of an unqualified outsider causing catastrophic delays would distract from his own department's earlier approvals. Mason, unaware of the political maneuvering happening around him, continued working through the aircraft's systems with single-minded focus, eventually discovering a component within the navigation array that did not match the manufacturer's specifications listed in the official maintenance records. The part looked correct at first glance, identical in shape and placement to the genuine component, but a closer inspection revealed subtle differences suggesting it had been swapped out without proper documentation. Isabella stared at the mismatched part for a long moment, the implications settling over her slowly and then all at once. This was not simply a technical oversight born of rushed deadlines. Someone at some point in the supply chain or the maintenance process had deliberately or carelessly introduced a part that did not belong in a fighter jet preparing for a critical demonstration and possibly future combat deployment. The thought unsettled her more than any board threat or contract deadline ever had, because a missed quarterly target could be recovered, but a pilot lost to a preventable failure could never be undone. Mason requested access to the security footage from the parts storage facility, hoping to trace exactly when and how the substitution had occurred, but Logan objected immediately and forcefully, citing concerns about chain of custody and procedural delays that conveniently protected his own department from scrutiny. Carter, growing increasingly impatient with the politics surrounding what was clearly a safety issue, overruled the legal team's objections and granted Mason 20 additional minutes to trace the problem to its source, regardless of how uncomfortable that process might become for anyone in the room. Mason used the time efficiently, opening a control panel near the navigation bay and searching methodically along the wiring until his fingers found exactly what he had expected, a small scorch mark precisely where heat stress from the substituted component would have caused electrical degradation over repeated use. The discovery of the scorch mark triggered a chain reaction that none of the engineers in the hangar had anticipated when the day began. Military security, already alerted to Mason's restricted file, escalated their inquiry to a higher clearance authority, and within minutes, Carter received confirmation that allowed him to access a partial summary of the sealed record. The hangar grew quiet in a way it had not been quiet all day, every engineer and technician sensing that something significant was unfolding even before Carter began to speak. Carter read aloud, carefully and without embellishment, that Mason Reed had once served as a specialist in combat aircraft restoration, a role that involved repairing fighter jets damaged in active conflict zones under conditions most engineers in the hangar would never experience in their entire careers. The file indicated that Mason had personally saved 3 pilots during a classified mission, repairing a critical flight control failure while the aircraft remained under active threat, work that had earned him commendations buried so deep in classified records that almost no one outside a small circle of command had ever known the details. According to the summary, Mason had worked through that repair in darkness, without proper tools, while enemy positions remained within range of the airfield, relying on nothing but memory, instinct, and a refusal to let 3 young pilots die on the ground beside an aircraft he believed he could still save. He had not left military service because of incompetence or failure, as Logan had so confidently assumed earlier that day, but because he had been used as a political scapegoat following a mission that powerful people wanted erased from public memory, his name quietly removed from the official account while the very protocols he developed were absorbed into doctrine without his credit. Isabella felt something shift inside her chest as Carter continued reading. A slow and uncomfortable recognition that the man she had publicly humiliated hours earlier had quietly written portions of the very emergency repair protocols her own company now used as standard procedure. She thought back to the moment she had ordered him dragged into the center of the hangar floor, and the memory now felt like something belonging to a different, smaller version of herself, one she was no longer sure she recognized. Logan's face drained of color as the implications of Mason's history settled over him. Because a man with this level of credibility and technical understanding would have no difficulty identifying every shortcut and oversight Logan's department had allowed to slip through. Mason, visibly uncomfortable with the attention now directed at him, asked Carter to stop reading the file aloud, his voice carrying an edge of genuine discomfort rather than false modesty. He explained simply that he had not come back into this world seeking recognition or sympathy, only to fix what was broken and return home to his daughter before the night grew too late. Carter respected the request and closed the file, but not before delivering a single statement that silenced any remaining doubt in the hangar regarding Mason's authority on the matter at hand. He told the assembled engineers plainly that if Mason Reed said this aircraft was not yet safe to fly, then no one in that hangar, regardless of rank or title, had the authority to put it in the air. With the truth of his background finally acknowledged, Mason returned his attention fully to the technical problem at hand, methodically walking the engineering team through the evidence he had assembled throughout the afternoon. He demonstrated that the persistent vibration error originated from a secondary sensor cluster that had been replaced with a cheaper, non-specification component, likely substituted somewhere along the supply chain in order to meet an aggressive production deadline. Logan found himself cornered by the documentation trail, because the final approval signature authorizing that component's installation belonged unmistakably to someone within his own department. Isabella's anger toward the situation was real, but it extended beyond Logan alone, settling instead on the broader culture she had cultivated within her own company, a culture so consumed with meeting deadlines and satisfying board members that employees had learned to bury problems rather than report them honestly. Mason did not indulge in any satisfaction at Logan's unraveling, choosing instead to focus entirely on correcting the aircraft's systems, because to him the safety of whatever pilot eventually flew this jet mattered infinitely more than settling old scores or proving a point. He had seen enough, in another life, to know exactly what carelessness could cost, and no amount of vindication in a Nevada hangar would ever feel as important as preventing that cost from repeating itself. He guided the engineering team through the process of recalibrating the control signal pathways, replacing the faulty component, and rebalancing the navigation system's response thresholds, working with the patient authority of someone who had performed this exact kind of repair under far worse conditions than a hangar in Nevada. Carter authorized one final ground test before the demonstration window closed entirely, and the assembled team watched in tense silence as the engines roared to life with a steadiness that had been absent all day, though a single unexpected warning flickered briefly across the diagnostic screen before settling. The remaining engineers, who only hours earlier had laughed openly at Mason's insistence on listening to engine sounds instead of trusting software readouts, now stood close enough to watch his hands move, taking mental notes the way students watch a teacher they finally respect. Isabella noticed the shift in the room's posture before she fully understood what had caused it, the subtle way people leaned toward Mason rather than away from him, the way questions were now addressed to him directly instead of filtered through Logan or anyone else with a title above his. She found herself wondering how many other capable people had passed through her company over the years, dismissed and overlooked simply because they did not carry themselves the way executives expected competence to look. It was an uncomfortable question, one she did not yet have an answer for, but one she suspected would follow her long after this particular crisis had passed. The test pilot scheduled for the demonstration had already climbed into the cockpit by the time the new complication revealed itself, and outside the hangar weather conditions were beginning to deteriorate more quickly than the forecast had predicted, thin clouds darkening over the runway while a cold wind began pulling at the windsocks near the tower. Mason recognized almost immediately that this new error did not originate from the aircraft's hardware at all, but from a software update Logan's team had installed earlier that day in the wrong sequence, layering a critical patch on top of an incompatible base version. Logan, sensing the walls closing in around him completely, attempted to quietly delete the update history from the system logs before anyone else noticed the mistake, hoping to erase evidence of his department's negligence before it could be traced back to him. Isabella witnessed the attempted deletion with her own eyes, standing close enough to see exactly what Logan was doing on the terminal, and she immediately ordered his system access revoked on the spot, her voice carrying a finality that left no room for negotiation. Mason worked quickly through the layered software conflict, manually unwinding the incorrect installation sequence, while simultaneously guiding 2 junior engineers through the correction process, all while keeping his voice calm enough to avoid rattling the pilot waiting inside the cockpit. In the middle of the tense repair, his phone buzzed briefly with a call from his daughter, and Mason stepped aside just long enough to tell her gently that he would be home later than expected, his voice softening for those few seconds in a way it had not softened all day, before he returned immediately to the work in front of him. He completed the final correction with only moments remaining before the system would have overheated from the conflicting processes still running in the background, his hands steady even as the seconds counted down toward failure. The aircraft's systems restarted cleanly, every warning light disappearing from the diagnostic display almost simultaneously, and for the first time since the demonstration had begun, the hangar filled with the sound of quiet, disbelieving relief. The test pilot, speaking through the radio connection to the ground crew, confirmed that the control response felt smoother and more precise than any previous test run he had experienced with this particular aircraft. Carter authorized a low-speed taxi test along the runway, watching closely as the jet moved with a stability that had been entirely absent only hours earlier. Isabella stood near the hangar entrance, watching Mason observe the test with quiet attentiveness. No triumph or vindication visible on his face, no demand for apology or acknowledgement crossing his lips. Security escorted Logan from the facility shortly afterward, once the evidence confirming his department's component substitution and his attempted deletion of the system logs had been fully verified by the technical review team. Mason, gathering his tools without any particular urgency, offered Isabella a single observation before turning to leave the hangar floor. He told her that aircraft rarely fell from the sky because of one catastrophic failure, but far more often because many people, each individually confident in their own small piece of the system, simply chose not to look closely enough at the parts they assumed someone else had already checked. Isabella absorbed that statement in silence for a long moment, turning the words over in her mind as she watched Mason walk back toward the maintenance bay where his tools were stored. When she finally spoke again, addressing him directly for what felt like the first time that entire day, she did not call him a contractor or a mechanic, the dismissive language she had used so freely just hours earlier. She called him Mr. Reed, the simple correction carrying more weight than either of them acknowledged aloud in that moment. The shift in her language was small, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention, but it marked something significant nonetheless, a quiet acknowledgement that the man she had publicly challenged had earned a level of respect she had withheld from him since the moment they met. Mason paused briefly at the sound of his own name spoken with something other than condescension, gave a small nod, and continued toward the maintenance bay without saying anything more. The engineers around the hangar exchanged glances, sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between the woman who ran the company and the man she had nearly destroyed professionally over a misunderstanding rooted entirely in appearances. Isabella remained standing near the hangar entrance long after Mason had disappeared from view, watching the now stable aircraft taxi slowly back toward its designated position, and beginning to understand the full weight of what had almost been lost that day, not just for her company, but for whatever a pilot might have eventually flown a jet no one had bothered to examine closely enough. The following morning, Isabella requested a private meeting with Mason in one of the smaller conference rooms attached to the hangar complex, away from the engineering staff and the lingering tension of the previous day's events. She began the conversation with an apology delivered without qualification or excuse, acknowledging directly that she had judged him based entirely on his appearance and his circumstances as a single father, never once considering that those circumstances said nothing meaningful about his competence or character. She admitted that her assumptions had nearly cost the company an aircraft, a contract, and quite possibly a pilot's life, and that the failure belonged to her leadership as much as it belonged to anyone in Logan's department. She continued, her voice quieter than the commanding tone she usually carried into meetings, explaining that she had built her entire career on the belief that competence always announced itself loudly, through credentials, through titles, through the right kind of confidence in a room full of strangers. Watching Mason work the previous day had forced her to confront how wrong that belief had been, and how many quiet, capable people she had likely overlooked in the years before she ever set foot in this particular hangar. Mason listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable in the way it had been throughout most of the previous day, neither accepting the apology with obvious warmth nor rejecting it with bitterness. When Isabella finished speaking, she slid a folder across the table toward him, explaining that she wanted to offer him a permanent position as chief safety consultant for the entire flight control program, with compensation far exceeding anything his previous contract had paid. Mason looked at the folder for a long moment without opening it, then quietly declined the offer, explaining that he had no interest in returning to a world that had once chewed him up and discarded him without ceremony, regardless of how generous the terms might now appear. Carter, who had been invited to sit in on the conversation given his role in verifying Mason's history, leaned forward and spoke with the directness of a man who had spent decades giving orders he believed in completely. He told Mason plainly that burying his skills out of old resentment would not undo the damage already done to him, but it would certainly prevent him from preventing future damage to pilots who had nothing to do with the politics that had once destroyed his career. He reminded Mason gently but firmly that the 3 pilots he had saved years earlier had gone on to fly other missions, raise families of their own, and live entire lives that would not exist had Mason chosen, on that distant night, to walk away from a broken aircraft instead of repairing it under fire. Isabella did not push the offer further or attempt to manipulate Mason's emotions toward accepting it, choosing instead to slide a second document across the table, a revised contract with one critical clause highlighted near the top of the first page. The clause granted Mason absolute authority to halt any test or deployment if he believed safety protocols had been compromised, a level of authority no one at his previous rank had ever been granted, civilian or military. Mason read the clause slowly, recognizing immediately that this was not an attempt to buy his silence or his loyalty through money alone, but a genuine acknowledgement that the very oversight he had once been punished for prioritizing was now being institutionalized as company policy. He sat with the weight of that realization for a long moment, understanding clearly that this offer represented something different from the world that had discarded him years earlier, a chance not to become wealthy, but to ensure that the kind of tragedy he had narrowly prevented yesterday would never again depend on luck alone. After a long silence, Mason agreed to a 90-day trial period, setting only one condition of his own in return: that no one within Grant Aerotech would ever again be permitted to dismiss the maintenance crews as lesser simply because their hands were dirtier than everyone else's in the building. In the weeks that followed, Grant Aerotech quietly restructured its safety review process, requiring maintenance personnel to be present and heard during every major safety meeting rather than relegated to silent execution of decisions made entirely by engineers above them. Isabella found herself listening more carefully in meetings she once would have rushed through, asking questions of people she once would have overlooked entirely, and slowly becoming the kind of leader who used her authority to elevate rather than dominate the people working beneath her. She began visiting the maintenance bay personally, something she had never once done during her years running the company, learning the names of mechanics whose work she had previously reduced to line items on a budget sheet. The engineers who once laughed at Mason's methods now sought his opinion before finalizing any major repair, and the culture of the hangar shifted from one of quiet competition into something closer to shared responsibility. Mason never sought public recognition for what had happened in that hangar, never gave interviews or accepted invitations to speak about his classified history, content instead to remain exactly as quiet and unassuming as he had always been. His name was formally restored within internal military maintenance records, the unjust circumstances of his original departure corrected through a process Carter personally oversaw with the same seriousness he brought to every other duty in his long career. Carter visited the Grant Aerotech facility one final time before the trial period ended, carrying with him a small case containing a service medal that had been quietly revoked years earlier following the politically motivated decisions that ended Mason's military career. He returned the medal without ceremony or speeches, simply placing it in Mason's hands and telling him that some debts, even late ones, were still worth settling properly. Mason carried the medal home that evening, arriving later than usual after another long day spent reviewing safety protocols with the engineering team, and he did not display it anywhere visible or mention it to anyone beyond a brief, quiet acknowledgement to his daughter that he had gotten something back that had been taken from him a long time ago. He placed the medal carefully inside an old wooden box in his bedroom closet, the same box that had held the few remnants of his military service for years, closing the lid without ceremony or dramatic reflection. The box also held a faded photograph of 3 young pilots standing beside an aircraft on a runway long since abandoned, and Mason allowed himself only a brief glance at it before setting the lid back down, the past finally feeling less like a wound and more like a chapter he no longer needed to hide. Isabella, who had grown to understand him far better over the preceding weeks than she had during their first encounter, recognized that Mason did not need applause or public vindication to feel that justice had finally been served. He needed only the simple, quiet confirmation that the truth about who he was and what he had sacrificed had finally been acknowledged by the people who mattered, even if the wider world never learned his name at all. The following morning, before the rest of the maintenance crew arrived for their shift, Mason stood alone outside the hangar entrance, watching the sun rise slowly over the desert runway where a fighter jet now sat fully repaired and fully trusted. He was no longer the man dragged into the center of a room to be humiliated and tested, but the man who had quietly reminded an entire industry why respect should never depend on the cleanliness of someone's hands or the size of someone's paycheck. If this story reminded you that judging someone by their appearance can cost more than anyone is willing to admit, then carry that lesson forward with you. And if you are curious where this world goes next, a different chief executive is about to discover that the silent janitor working quietly inside her own company once saved her life many years before she ever knew his name.